Hey folks, we were going last week. I tried to take that time, use that time to grade your first test, and then take a look at some of what you're turning in for the second piece. But today what we're going to do is we're going to get started on talking about personality disorders. And this is one of my favorite sections of the class, really just because I find them interesting. There's nothing particularly profound here, but there are some really interesting ways that the human mind can be put together, and ways in which we would consider these folks to be disordered that we're going to look at here. Now, first of all, remember that personality disorders are seated on that axis 2 of the 5-axial model, and up until this point, everything that we've really been talking about, at least directly, we've had some conversations about things offhand. Really, that just means tangents. I go on, but for the most part, everything that we've talked about officially up until this point has been a axis 1 disorder, which is to say, generally we think that this is something that the person gets, that they catch, so to speak, or they develop, and this is also something, axis 1 disorders are things that we expect that we can help a person recover from. And that's the general idea we talked about during that first class, how sometimes that doesn't pan out, how some axis 1 disorders really are a little bit more systemic and there to stay, and how maybe some axis 2 disorders are a little less stagnant in terms of the psychology of the individual. But personality disorders are really the thing that we're looking at, even when we say the idea of an axis 2 disorder. I used to work at a clinic where some of the other staff would use that as code to indicate that they thought somebody had a personality disorder. That is to say, they'd say, this person's got a little axis 2 stuff going on. And that tended to mean, of course, that this person's got kind of a character in general, a personality in general that is a bit strange, a bit unusual, versus maybe just having something that is abnormal for them as well, right? Something that they've caught or something that they've developed, right? It's one thing you meet somebody and they're depressed and they're acting a certain way, or they're anxious and they're acting a certain way out of that anxiety, but you might come to understand, well, they're not usually like this, or when they're in a better state of mind, they're going to be a lot different, right? Versus you meet somebody and they're acting in these kind of strange ways. And again, folks at our clinic would say they've got some axis 2 stuff going on, which usually again means personality disorder stuff, which means that this isn't going to change probably. This is going to be what you have to work with. This is going to be the person, and maybe you're working on that thing, but you're going to have a really, really hard time changing it, certainly from the internal perspective. But that if you're working on something else, you're going to have to kind of work through that. You're going to have to work through that particular personality. I have been told that personality disorders were actually originally intended to help the clinician understand what types of personalities, what types of character traits might indeed affect the relationship, or might indeed affect the therapeutic process in general. So that these disorders, these personality disorders, weren't so much to say, hey, here's the thing that we need to fix about this person, or here's the thing that's wrong with this person. But really, at first, or at least one dominant way it was used, was to say, this person's a narcissist. This person's got narcissistic personality disorder. We'll talk about that eventually. And you're not going to be able to do much to change that. You're not going to be able to make this person significantly less narcissist. You might be able to get them to say less narcissistic things to you. You might get them to dress or act or behave, right, broadly in less narcissistic ways. But they're going to always, for the most part, going to feel how they feel about themselves, and in comparison to you, right, that's usually going to be better if they're a narcissist. And so what that means is you're not going to necessarily be able to change that. But if this person comes in because they're depressed, you're going to have to work through, work past, or work with that narcissism in order to get to the depression, right? This stuff's going to show up. They're going to maybe be offended that you didn't offer them the nicer chair, or they're going to feel like they have to show you up in terms of what they're wearing, or they're going to feel like they have to start every session by telling you something amazing and awesome that happened in their life before they get to, or maybe you have to dig to get to that part about them being sad, right? Because hey, here's a narcissist who doesn't want to admit to any failings, including being sad or depressed, right? And so, and that's just one example. But the idea, of course, is that you're gonna have to, if you're a clinician and somebody shows up with a personality disorder and that's not what they're there to work on, you're gonna have to work past that. You're gonna have to work through that in order to get to the issue at hand. And so that's just a couple ways to conceptualize these things. But of course, we should probably look at the actual definition of a personality disorder. This is on a page I did not mark down, so I won't pause the video. Just Google it, or look through the table of contents, and you should be able to find where this definition is. It is on the first page of when they start talking about personality disorders. It's written in a paragraph form. I like to pull it out here like I did when we looked at the definition of the mental disorder, just so that we can break it down piece by piece to understand again exactly what it is that we're talking about. And then the last thing that I'll probably do in this video is just get this list filled in where we're looking at what each of the personality disorders is. Now, for me, I usually will spend a whole class, sometimes on one disorder, but certainly on each cluster. And so I'm gonna, of course, do my best to make sure we get through this stuff in a timely fashion. One of the things that is helpful, and I may end up just either including or adding some things to them, is it was about this time last semester that we stopped meeting in person, and so I actually have a lot of these personality disorder lectures already recorded, and they're just from my house, and I think one time they went on a hike, but they are already up there. And so if we start running short on time, or I think I'm not going to be able to fit these in, I may just direct you to those and start in this lecture, in these lectures, maybe just adding some stuff that I'd forgotten in those other videos, or just some other things that might be interesting details. So don't feel too rushed about this. I will make sure that you get all of the information one way or another. But like I said, I do like to spend some time here. Of course, our semester's been weird, so time is a thing I'm honestly still figuring out. So if I have to point you to these other things, I think that should be fine. So let's look here at this definition. A personality disorder is an enduring pattern of inner experience and behavior. So we're just gonna stop there to let you know, well, it's really just saying it is who the person is, right? It's not just how they're acting, but it is also their inner experience. This is to say their mind or their feelings or the way they process information or whatever it is. We're both talking about the internal and the external world here, right? So an enduring pattern of inner experience and behavior that one deviates, that means is different than, deviates markedly, that means a lot, so is a lot different from the expectations of the individual's culture. Deviates markedly from the expectations of the individual's culture. So this is actually pretty similar to what we saw in the mental disorder definition, where really the first thing that we're looking for is this abnormal by the kind of regular use of the word? Is this something that is different? Is this what everybody's doing? Is this kind of run-of-the-mill behavior, or does this stand out in some way, even if we haven't delved into why it stands out? And so the first thing that we're looking for, similar to a mental disorder, and probably similar to any type of physical disorders or pathogens, is does it stand out? Does it catch our attention? Does it look different than what we would expect someone from that culture to look like, to act like, to think like? So first piece, and then we go on to is pervasive and inflexible. So it looks different and it's pervasive. Pervasive means that it spreads out everywhere. If you take a dry sponge and you dip it in water, the water will pervade the sponge, right? And so it means it's everywhere and inflexible, which means here that you can't change it, it cannot be changed. So it is everywhere and it cannot be changed. This is an important piece of understanding a personality disorder and not misdiagnosing a personality disorder that is for yourself or for somebody that you're working with, because this is the thing that you're going to have to come back to. And if you're already thinking about your paper, I know some of you are like that, this is the thing that I will be looking for the most. Did you check for this? Is it pervasive? Is it everywhere? And can they change it? If somebody's got a true personality disorder, if somebody is truly a narcissist, I'm using that one because I think that's just one folks have kind of a casual familiarity with. If a person is truly a narcissist, that is to say they have a narcissistic personality disorder, well, they're not going to be narcissistic and showy and trying to show everyone up at work, but then when they get home with their family, they can play the doting husband and make sure that they put their wife and their kids' needs first, right? No, if a person is a true narcissist, it will be pervasive, it will be everywhere, and they won't be able to change it unless usually they do a lot of therapy. Again, that just changes the behavior. They will still want to tell their wife, I'm much better at setting the table than you, let me do it. So this piece about pervasive and inflexible is one of the most important pieces. As somebody who's got a narcissistic personality disorder or any personality disorder will demonstrate those personality traits, those abnormal personality traits everywhere, and they will not be able to change them. Hey, we're gonna go to your little brother's baseball game and he's gonna get a really big award. We just need you not to try to hog the spotlight, right? Again, maybe the older brother, the brother that's got the narcissism can do that. Maybe he can stop himself from doing that, but he definitely is going to want to. We're not going to be able to stop him from wanting to. Pervasive and inflexible, okay? Keep that in mind. Number 3, has an onset in adolescence or early adulthood. So we're just letting you know here that these things are going to start at a very young age. Now, these things may actually start, and this is just my opinion, I think it's right, but it is just my opinion, and I'll tell you why they have to write it like this. I think some personality disorders, not all of them, and I think personality disorders for some people, not all of them, can show up at an earlier age. That is to say, one of the reasons that we go with adolescence or early adulthood is because of the nature of a personality disorder. It's pervasive and inflexible. So if I rightly diagnose you with a personality disorder, some miracle has to happen that if the doctors are following correct regimen, that they ever would pull that off your chart. Because a personality disorder is known to stick, it's known to stay, it's known to be pervasive and inflexible, if I have correctly diagnosed you with a personality disorder, unless we figure out some new form of treatment or I had misdiagnosed you in the first place, we would almost certainly expect that there's not really a way for that personality disorder to truly go away. Again, you can begin managing the behaviors, you can begin saying different things, but you will feel and think how you feel and think. And so one of the reasons that we say adolescence or early adulthood is because we don't want to put that on a kid's chart if we're not sure, if maybe they're still developing or they're going through a phase and we just don't have enough information, we just haven't had enough time in their life to see if, well, maybe from the ages of 5 to 10, they like shooting squirrels out of the tree and, stealing birds from their parents, I don't know. But but soon after that, they got older, and it actually turned out that they were just, an anxious kid and really depressed. And so once they got out of that situation, their behavior changed totally, their way of thinking changed totally. And so we want to give enough time, A, and then of course, B, we don't want to be putting these things on a person's chart until we actually know that that's what's going on. And we certainly don't want to put it on a person's chart as a misdiagnosis where it might stay on their chart forever, even if we got it wrong. So one of the things that you'll see when we start looking at some of the individual personality disorders is that certain disorders can't even be diagnosed until a certain age. So usually that's about 15, in some cases 17, before we can even give that diagnosis, before I'm even allowed to put it on your chart at all, because you wouldn't meet criteria if you're not. Again, it'll be specific to the diagnosis, but the diagnosis may say, this is an individual who's 15 years or older and has X, 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 Y, 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 Z. So again, this has some truth to it, right? That we do expect in some cases that this is when it's gonna show up. But in my experience, I would say that if a person's about to have a personality disorder, you're gonna see that on them as a kid. It might not be diagnosable at that time, just technically, or even in terms of them meeting the other criteria, right? Some of this stuff may still be developing. It might be that for certain kids, it looks like they're about to have a personality disorder, and then, right, something changes or they change, and so it doesn't turn out that way. And so there are all these reasons in which you could be a kid and not have a personality disorder when it looks like you're going to have one. But again, I would say if you end up as an adult with a personality disorder, probably there were signs when you were 7. Probably there were some things I could have looked at and said, I can't diagnose this yet, but here are some things I'm noticing about what this person, what this child might develop into in terms of their personality, in terms of their character. So again, this is true, but really it's more thinking about the diagnostic side than it is the psychological side. Similar to pervasive and inflexible is stable over time. So these are kind of saying the same thing, but pervasive here is really meaning everywhere in a kind of physical, local sense, right? It's at work, it's at school, it's at home, it's at the gym, it's wherever. Whereas inflexible, again, is meaning I can't change it, I can't do anything to make it different. Stable over time is kind of connecting these 3 things, which is to say, not only will I see it at work and at school, but I should see it on you when you're 16, 25, 35, 45, right? That I should be able to see that this personality, this disordered personality, is indeed stable over time, right? That it's not that when you turned 25, you got out of that funk and then you realize the value of other people and you stop being a narcissist. That's not usually how that goes. We'll talk about that a little bit more when we get to narcissism. Narcissism is one that I think is probably the most likely to be changeable, if any of them are changeable. And so that's why I'm pausing in these examples, because there probably are some ways that you could begin to change the way a narcissist in particular thinks. But when we start thinking about borderline personality or antisocial or avoidant or some of these other things, those are all still pervasive and inflexible, stable over time. Narcissism is still pervasive and inflexible and stable over time. I just think it has, this is just comparatively, I think it has the most wiggle room, which is still very, very, very little. Lastly, leads to distress or impairment, and this is just the thing that we're going to add to everything to keep it consistent with the other mental disorders, which is to say, it's not just that you're weird, it's not just that you've got these kind of behaviors that are different and that they have stuck with you all this time, but is it a problem? Is it causing a problem? If you're just a confident person and you're a good leader and somebody over here thinks you're a narcissist, but it's not really causing a problem with your work, it's not really causing a problem in your relationships or with your peers, then is it a problem? And so we we think about that idea of a problem, and I think I said this when we were talking about mental disorders, we think about that idea of a problem not just a problem for me, because if I'm a narcissist, you know, what's my problem? I'm perfect, so it's your problem, right? That's how the narcissist is going to feel. Same with probably an antisocial personality and some of the others. That sometimes that problem can be thought of from an outside perspective. This person is disruptive wherever they go work. This person is disruptive in any relationship they get into. This person's relatively neglectful to their children because they're only thinking about themselves all the time, right? And so we're not just looking for that sense of, is it making me upset? Is it causing me to think differently about myself, right? Is it causing me problems? That's important, but we are also looking for, is it causing problems in your life, whether or not you think it's a problem, and is it perhaps causing problems in other people's lives who you come in contact with, right? Connecting that to all these other pieces. It's not just, I bragged one time and that upset so-and-so who lost the award, and that would just be one time, but again, is it stable over time? Is it pervasive and inflexible? Am I doing that all the time? Am I bragging all the time such that people around me are annoyed? Am I talking myself up in such a way that other people feel like they're being undervalued, you know, in almost every relationship? So those are the things that we're looking for, and really looking for, is this happening all the time, everywhere, or is this maybe just a role they're putting on, right? You can imagine a movie star, thinking about narcissism again, who, when they're on an interview, when they're on stage, right? When they're in some place where they're expected to be this glamorous person, or they're expected to be, you know, this rich and famous idea of a movie star, that maybe they're actors in the first place, right? So maybe they're ginning that up, right? I'm so great, you know, this movie, you gotta see it, nobody's ever done a movie better than me, whatever it is. I sound like somebody else, but that is potentially just an act they're putting on, but then they go home and they're sweet to their kids, and they, you know, make sure that everything gets made, and they're not thinking about themselves. They don't mind, you know, if you see them out of their makeup or whatever, right? And so sometimes you can see that folks will have these personality characteristics, but again, we're really looking for, and I know I'm keep pressing this, but we're really looking for that pervasive and inflexible nature, such that, sorry, Dr. Carter's making faces at me through the door. They're really looking for that pervasive and inflexible nature, which is what makes it a personality disorder, right? That it's stuck on you, that it isn't something that you can kind of put on or take off. Another thing I like to just think about when we talk about personality disorders, and I try not to use up too much more of my board space, but here's this idea. This says normal, and this says personality disorder. I don't like the term normal, but it's just helpful here. So this is a strange analogy, but I think folks can find it helpful sometimes. So if we think about personality as being this kind of, you know, amorphous psychological construct, right? That this is a normal personality, and over here we've got some traits of, you know, maybe this person brags or is confident, and maybe here this person has a hard time, you know, facing their own issues, and over here this person can be a little bit manipulative, and over here this person can be you know, distrustful of others, right? And all of this comes together to make a certain personality. All of this comes together to make the person who they are. These aren't any kind of personality traits that we would recognize in a personality theory, but I'm going somewhere with it. And so what I mean is to say is, right, you can recognize this as perhaps a touch of narcissism, and here's some manipulation, a touch of borderline, doesn't like facing issues, maybe a touch of avoidant, is distrustful of others, a touch of a schizoid personality, right? And then maybe some these other kind of minor lumps that I didn't note. Well, this is normal, and that is to say, when we start getting into the specifics of the personalities or the personality disorders and their traits and their identifiers, you're definitely going to notice. You are definitely going to notice, oh my God, I do that. Oh my God, I do that. Oh my God, I do 9 of those 10 things, right? Again, I want to bring you back to pervasive and inflexible. Sure, you do some of that stuff because they're features of personalities. They are features of characters, right? Sometimes people brag. Sometimes people have trust issues, right? All of these different things. But what, again, we're looking for, is it pervasive and inflexible, and is it stable over time? Is it pervasive and flexible, and is it stable over time? If it's just something that you do sometimes, or you did that one time, or you do when you're feeling a little worried, or you do when you're feeling, really confident in yourself, but that's not always, right? That's normal. So keep that in mind, because what I like to say is, if it were truly a personality disorder and you were truly a narcissist, your personality would look more like this, right? And here's that big narcissism. And you got all this other stuff, right? Still some characteristics of other people. You're still a person, you're not all narcissist, but pervasive and inflexible. This is a large, constant part of your personality. It's not the type of thing where you bring it out sometimes, or you bring it out in this situation. It would be the type of thing where I am always showing up as the narcissist. I'm always the best one in the room. I'm always going to let you know it. I'm always going to be offended if you don't know it, and blah, 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 blah. Okay? Okay, so last piece for this, which will be a bit of a short video, but it's just an introduction before we start to get into each one of these, is to look at these personality disorders and how they're grouped together in what we call clusters. Now, these clusters don't have a whole lot of meaning anymore. So we originally grouped these into clusters because we thought that they, what I like to call hung together well. That is to say, that they had some real similarities and overlaps in terms of traits, in terms of how the behaviors looked, in terms of how people experienced them. But anymore, we're seeing that maybe one or two, or maybe the whole group, or maybe a couple in that group don't really go together the way that we think they should go together. This is similar to, of course, what I was saying with the Axis 1 or the 5 axial model, right? That it kind of begins to fall apart if you dig into it a lot. But unlike the axial model, which the DSM does remove, and again, I was just using that, I still want you to use it, using that for teaching purposes. I think it's helpful to teach. They actually have left this in, and they will even note, you can read it for yourself in the DSM, where they say, we left them in these clusters because it's easier to teach and it's just a convenient way to organize them, but you shouldn't put too much stock in the fact that a couple of them go together in a cluster and others of them go into other clusters, right? It doesn't really mean that they're that much more similar versus being that much more different. It is just a way to organize them. And again, I do think it does have some helpfulness in terms of remembering what they are. So the first, cluster A, is often known as the Odd and Eccentric Cluster. That is to say, the disorders in here will be ones that really kind of show up on the individual that make them look different than everyone else. It really is hitting on that deviates markedly piece that we see in this definition. And so we will look at some examples of this going forward, but these are going to be the disorders where folks just sort of look and seem and feel a bit odd than others. Now I say that, but the very first disorder in here is one that doesn't quite hang with the others. So the first one is a paranoid personality disorder. We'll talk a bit more about this as going forward, but this disorder basically is one in which you don't trust people. You think people are out to get you in most cases. So again, this won't fit with the other two, which are a little bit more of the odd and eccentric. And these are the schizoid and the schizotypal. Personalities. They're not really related to schizophrenia. Some folks used to talk about how if you put these together, you get a schizophrenic. I don't see that. I'm not going to say too much about it, but basically here's a person who just likes to be alone, that doesn't really enjoy having relationships, and then here's a person who is just weird, for lack of a better word. They are the odd and eccentric here, and maybe that sounds mean, but it's true, and we'll take some looks at some examples the next couple days. Cluster B here, the first one you have, so this one is called the dramatic and erratic cluster. This is the cluster that if you recognize any personality disorders, you will probably recognize them here. This is also considered to be, if we can rank them in this way, the sort of most severe, or at least the most troubling to onlookers. I guess we could say, not all of them, but several of them, starting, of course, with an antisocial personality. We will look more into this, but be careful, or just know up front that antisocial is different than asocial. Usually when you hear people say antisocial in a kind of a regular talk or a regular conversation, they really mean asocial. They really mean antisocial means against society. Asocial means without society. And so usually when somebody's saying, oh, you're being really antisocial, they really mean you're being really asocial. You're being separate, you're not communicating, you're not talking. Antisocial means, no, I'm getting in there, but I'm just, I'm fighting it. I'm going the opposite direction of you. So antisocial personality disorder, followed up by the other one we talked about when we looked at a couple of these, which is the borderline personality disorder. We talked about how both of these may have some connection to a reactive attachment disorder, and how borderline looks a little more manipulative than antisocial, but both really seem to be about getting one's needs met in a very extreme way. Again, we watched some videos about a couple of those reactive attachment pieces. Next, we have the histrionic. And here we have the hallmark of this dramatic piece. If you just look up the word histrionics, you'll get a bit of a sense of what this disorder is like. But basically, it's a person who craves attention, not in the same way that the narcissist does, who also craves attention. But the narcissist craves positive attention. Right? Don't show up talking about how ugly my shoes are. That is attention. But I'm not going to have it unless you're telling me how awesome they are. The histrionic person would say, oh, you noticed my shoes. Right? And so here's the difference between these two. We will talk more about that. In the cluster C, these are known as the anxious cluster. You will see that a lot of these disorders have anxiety or fear associated with them. The first is the avoidant personality disorder. It's what it sounds like. We'll talk about that as we get there. The second is the dependent personality disorder. These two share some similarities in terms of how they think about themselves and how they think about the need for relationships, which we'll talk about. Of course, And then lastly is one that we have briefly talked about in here as well, which is the obsessive compulsive personality disorder. So here's all 10 of them. There are 10, 3, 4, and 3. And again, we put them into these clusters, but as we begin to break them down, you will see that sometimes they don't quite fit in with their cluster. For instance, I think paranoid probably fits better down here with cluster B, but again, that doesn't really matter. We don't really use the clusters for anything except this moment when I'm teaching them to you to think about how they hang together and what similarities they do have, but also what differences they have. There is some niceness in kind of having a dispute here, is because we'll get to talk about it a little more deeply than we would if it was perfectly organized, right? We can talk about how it maybe has some similarities that make them look the same, but what's the psychological piece that's going on that maybe actually makes them really different and makes the paranoid personality closer to a borderline or a histrionic personality than it does really a schizoid personality. So we'll get into all of that next time. I usually go in order. Sometimes I skip B, go to C, and then come back to B just because it's more interesting. But we'll get through all of them. We will be starting with cluster A next week. Usually I can get through cluster A in one video, especially since I'm not going to be showing videos in class. I'll just link those into the playlist. One of the reasons I really like this section, I guess I can say, is because it's great for examples. We didn't look at a lot of examples when we were looking at things like depression and anxiety. We did for PTSD and OCD, but with many of those, it just looks like somebody's suffering, right? It just looks like, oh, I'm really anxious, or oh, I'm really sad, right? There's not a whole lot to say, what are you recognizing here? But when we get to these personality disorders, because it's not just the distress, sometimes there's no distress on the part of the individual, but because it's not just the distress, we're going to get to kind of see how all of these different personalities, ways of thinking, emotional context, how these things show up on folks who are diagnosed with them. Usually these are just videos that I find on YouTube, so it's going to be easy to get them in the playlist. So usually these are just movies I find on YouTube where somebody's saying, hey, I've got this disorder, I want to teach you a bit about it. As you can imagine, some of those are easier to come by than others, right? This group's probably a little more likely to show themselves up than this group, right? Or this group who can have some anxiety about social settings. So we'll do what we can do. I think I found some good examples just from previous years. So look out for those in addition to looking for the rest of the lectures. You may see me just reference certain videos in certain lectures. So just be sure to make sure you check those out. All right, that's it for this intro. Next week we'll start talking about cluster A, hopefully get through it, and then on to cluster B and cluster C. See you soon.